This is Patrick Godwin. He's a sophomore here at the university, and he's a Microsoft developer evangelist. And you should probably talk to him, he'll probably talk about it here, but about all the free stuff that you can win at Microsoft right now, because they're pushing really hard for Windows 8.
It's insane.
Yeah, and you can take it away.
Thank you very much, Sean. So as you said, my name is Patrick Godwin. I'm a Microsoft Student Insider, and today we're here to kind of go over developing cool Windows Store apps using HTML5 and JavaScript. So for those of you, I may imagine some of you know that back in August, Microsoft released Windows 8 manufacturing. It kind of represents a rapid shift in the future of Windows. And with that, they released the Windows Store, which is a new way of delivering full-screen apps that are more geared towards tablet and touchscreen devices to your users. So today what we're going to build is actually, there's a API for seeing which cane computers are available to be used, or which ones are open, which ones are closed. That's a really nice JSON API, and we're going to go ahead and build a Windows Store app that wraps that and shows us, which buildings are actually available and which computers can be used. So the thing to note here when we're actually looking at this is what the final app's going to look like when we're done today. What we're using here, this is called a GridView control. This is like a really key control when it comes to navigation in Windows 8. We're going to I'm going to explain it more in depth here in a few minutes, but it's a very useful control. We're going to show how we can build this application using strictly HTML5 and JavaScript. Another really important thing to note is that this is not running like in a web view. How many of you have used PhoneGap or Titanium? Or, some of you may know there are HTML5 and JavaScript actual application frameworks for systems like iPhone, I believe Windows Phone, and Android. Those all run inside of the web browser in a web view control. That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here, we're seeing actual JavaScript and HTML or JavaScript running on top of native code. So there's an actual host application that is rendering this as if it were a native application to the OS. So actually, let me jump out here just so we can all have code. Can everyone see that okay? Don't need to expand everything. So first thing to I want to go over is just to kind of give you a look at what some of the code for a GridView looks like. So this is I'm just going to show a generic GridView. This is what comes with a out-of-the-box template. This is going to be a bunch of lorem ipsum, da-da-da-da-da, nothing really terribly interesting. But as we can see, we have, these are grouped list view items, and we can actually click on an item to view into it. Windows Store apps have these idea of navigation. You start at the top level of your application, and you can navigate based on group or based on item. So you have typically 3, maybe 4 levels of navigation for the user. So this is all a pre-populated group of data that we can actually see here if we pop into grouped items.js in the template. We see that we're actually grabbing some JSON data from a data.js file. And all that kind of happens is here is we generate up a couple of sample groups and sample items, and we're just binding them to a grid. So now I'm going to kind of dive in deeper and actually show us how we would take our own kind of data and populate a grid view using that. So I'm not sure if anyone saw, but I actually posted a GitHub or a template up on GitHub. This template kind of gives us a starting ground because the blank template for Windows Store apps and JavaScript doesn't give us everything. The one thing it's lacking is this navigator.js file and this in this little div right here in default.html. Now what this div does is, has anyone used a single page application before or developed one like that, like a HTML application that all runs in one frame? Yeah, or it's can be kind of also thought of as an iframe, just not as horrible. But basically what this div does is it will host all of the content for the application views within one main view and allow us to navigate kind of as if they were their own frames. So by default, we're actually pointing the navigator at pages, or at our main page.html, and this is where we're going to kind of build that first grid view out. So if we go ahead and move over into main page.html, we'll see that we've got actually, if we run the application right now, we've just got a blank, boring old page. Nothing in there, just Kane lab status, content goes here. So we're going to want to go ahead and actually populate this with a grid view. The way we do that is we go ahead right here in this section, main content. We're going to add a div and set the class. We're going to be using selectors here, and we're going to be selecting based on the CSS class they're assigned to. So we're going to go with building list view, and then we're going to go ahead and set these now. In HTML, there exists this concept of like data attributes, which kind of give us attributes that are outside of the HTML standard. And Windows 8 brings their own set of data attributes to WinJS. So the data attribute we want to use to actually tell this div to be a grid view is data win control. And when we go ahead and say that this, we're going to get some IntelliSense here, and we have different kinds of actual pre-built user interface controls that we can use. The one we're interested in is ListView. So there we've got our div, and this is going to be the, why is there a, okay, that's interesting. This is how what we're going to put our data in. So the next thing we need to do is we actually need to go ahead and set some properties on that div to make it actually be usable. So over here, and I just want to go ahead and say that we're going to be using something similar to jQuery. It's called WinJS. The only reason we're not using, I mean, jQuery is supported in here. You can go ahead and grab your own copy of jQuery and throw it in. But this is a JavaScript library that ships as a part of Windows now and is native to Windows and is optimized for app building. So the first thing we want to do is we actually want to grab a reference to that list view we just created. So in the JavaScript, we go var list view is equal to element, and this is just the root element of the page we're in. Query selector, and we're going to go based on that class we just defined. And we're going to go ahead and grab the actual win control member of that object. Win control is just an extension of the DOM object. It gives us the special controls that allow us to perform modifications to the actual Windows 8 UI control, as well as define templates and perform data binding. So what we're going to want to go ahead and do next is set some properties on the actual list view. We're going to first say that the layout is of type WinJS.UI.GridView, or grid layout. And this just kind of tells WinJS how to lay out the actual list view. There are multiple ways you can have a list view look. We're just going to choose the grid of tiles like we see in Windows 8. Next thing we want to do is we want to set the list view's selection mode, which just decides whether or not we can actually select an item and perform actions on it. We're going to want to go ahead and set that to none because we're not performing any transforms on the actual objects. So now we've gone ahead and done that. We'll go ahead and run the application. We won't see any data in there, but that's because we haven't populated it with anything yet. But we've gotten rid of that. Content goes here, kind of nonsense. And we see we actually have a control here that's just kind of empty right now. So the next step to actually build this out and perform more on it is we need to actually get data and populate it with it. So in order to do this, we're actually going to use the Kane host info API, which there's actually a really nice app by Chris Zombach for iOS up on GitHub. You can go take a look at the code. It's really cool. We're just going to be doing some basic things on it. It's just a simple URI that the university has been kind enough to provide us that has some JSON data. I'm actually going to go ahead and just do a quick query so we can kind of see what kind of data we're getting back from it before we actually move into it. Visual Studio is free, so you're kidding me? So let's go ahead and do a GET request. Come on. There we go. As we can see, we've got this JSON, this 850 object large JSON data structure that contains these items. So in the first view, what we're actually going to want to do is we're going to want to go ahead and populate that with what buildings we can actually go to and view as a part of this Kane API. And so to do that, we're going to first create two objects here. We're going to go var buildings. Now this is going to be a of type WinJS.binding.list. Now a binding list is similar to a JavaScript array, except it has some added on functionality that allows us to perform what's called data binding. And what data binding essentially allows us to do is it allows us to take a data model that we've pulled from whatever data source and bind it to a user interface, so that the user interface, we don't have to manually say, okay, every time we get a new object, add it to the user interface. The user interface just gets a collection and automatically populates itself with the data. So another thing we need to have is we need to have a list of the names of the buildings so that we're not adding multiple entries, because we're grabbing them from the actual computer object, so it gets kind of tricky like that. What we're going to do now is we're actually going to go ahead and query that API. So it's WinJS. In order to do this, we're going to use an XML HTTP request. And we're going to use WinJS.xhr. It's a nifty little helper method that they've written that just allows us to designate a URL, and it'll perform a request on that. So URL is API URI. And there we go. So what this code will do is it'll go out to the web service and pull down all the JSON data, or the text. And this actual method call returns what's called a promise. And a promise is essentially a kind of, it's when we call a method, we get an object back that describes what the data is going to look like, but it doesn't have any data in it because the query hasn't actually finished executing. So what it basically says is we're going to get you some data at some point, but not right now. And what we need to do now that we have this promise, we need to tell the promise what to do when the data is actually ready for us to do there. And so the way to do this is we call .done, and we get three methods that we can pass into it: on complete, on error, and on progress, so that we can handle different scenarios. For this one, we're just going to handle on done, which we're going to pass in a function with response. Now the response object is just a normal XML HTTP response, so we're going to go and check to first make sure that the response is okay. So we're going to make sure that the status is equal to 200 before we actually perform any data on it. Else we're just going to ignore it. Next thing we want to do is we want to parse the data from it. Parse response text. This will just go ahead and take all that nice little data and populate it into a nice JSON object. Now what we need to do is we're going to iterate through the data. resData.forEach function item. And we're just going to go ahead and add it to that binding list that we created earlier there that our UI is eventually going to bind to. And so in here, we're going to go ahead and say var building is equal to a new JavaScript object. And it's going to be building name is item.location.building. And the image, which this is how we're going to actually get some like color for the tile on the grid view. I've gone ahead and included some data URI images that are just 1 pixel by 1 pixel solid colors. And we're going to use the dark gray for this one. So we can go ahead and say dark gray, and that's our building object. Now, before we actually add it to the array, we want to make sure that it's not already in there. So we're going to go if name list index of building name is -1. And go ahead and add it. Push building.
Wait, why would it be in the? I'm just curious. Why would it be? Is that a?
So yeah, so when we if we look back at the actual array here, we see that each computer tells us which building is located in.
Okay, I understand. So you're getting a list of computers.
Yeah, we're getting a list of computers, and we're sorting it to basically figure out.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah. So like
that's a bad API.
It's yeah, it's friendlier than what it could be, I guess.
Yeah,
as opposed to like scraping the actual like HTML page and echoing out there using regexes, but it could definitely be much better. And we're gonna go ahead and actually just push the building name onto there. And so this actually goes ahead and this just adds each object to our binding list, and we're done.
I think you're missing an H.
Am I where I'm missing an H? There we go. What we need to do now is we actually need to expose this data object to the rest of the application. Because right now it's just sitting in a JavaScript file, we can't really interact with it yet. So the way we do that is when we define a namespace in WinJS. So in order to do this, we do winjs.namespace.define. We say the namespace name is Kane. And the object members, for now we're just going to expose buildings to the rest of the application. So this will basically make this this building's data list that we've created available to the rest of the application for any object that includes the Kane API. So now that we've got that, we can actually go back into mainpage.js, and we can tell this ListView to get its data from the Kane API. So we can say ListView dot data source, item data source is equal to Kane dot buildings dot data source. Now, if we run the application, I'm pretty sure we're just going to get a bunch of JSON objects passed in there, but we do in fact have the data binding working. It's in there. We can see that we've got Bates rooms in there. So we've got the data coming down from the API, but now we need to make it look presentable is the next key. And so now that we have this object that we're binding to the UI, we need to describe what that object actually looks like in a grid view. And what we do to do that is we create item templates. And what these item templates are, they're just dummy kind of HTML elements that get automatically populated into the data list when we use it. So the way we do this is we go ahead and we add another div back in our main page. We say that we're going to go ahead and use the ID for this one. We're just going to say it's item template. And we're going to set the data win control equal to winjs.binding.template. So all objects in the winjs.binding namespace are meant to just solely help with data binding. It comes in really handy, but it also is a double-edged sword because it's one of the hardest things in the world to debug. The next thing we do is we're going to go ahead and say div. We're going to be indexing these by class name again. We're just going to set this as the actual item container. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to add an image to it. Set the source equal to just pound for now. And we're going to set the class equal to item image. And the data when bind. Now this is a different property that we're using here. And what this property does is it basically tells the control which part of the data model to bind to, and which property to bind that data to. So we're going to want to bind the source of the image to the image that we created back here in the Kane API. This is right here. So now that we've done that, hold on, wrong file. We can go in and we also want to go ahead and put in the building name on that actual tile. So we're going to go create another div, and this is going to be called the item overlay. And this will actually sit on top of the tile and will kind of look like it's laying over the image. And it's just going to have one member. It's going to be a header. H4 class is equal to building name. And then the data win source is inner text to the building main. Now that we've gone ahead and actually created this item template, we need to tell the list view to use it. And the way we do this is we go back over into our main page.js, and we go right in here and we say ListView.item template is equal to element.query selector item template. And that's that. Now if we run it, we'll see that the grid is still there, but it doesn't still, like we have them, but it's more like a mishmash of a grid rather than something that's actually human readable. So to actually make this styled and make it look properly, we have to use CSS. That's the third part of designing applications using HTML in Windows 8. To save us some time, I've actually gone ahead and included in the GitHub sample just a pre-populated CSS file that I'm going to step through right now and actually describe the CSS properties on it.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
So they like changed the JavaScript up a little bit and added like their own like promises, right?
Yeah.
It's not something that you can get with normal JavaScript.
Right.
Is that the same with CSS? I know they have like.
So the only things I believe they've added to CSS, they've added, and I'm going to go over these actually in here. They have some like how Mozilla Firefox has their own CSS properties with the -moz prefix.
Right.
There are some of those that pertain to grid views that we're actually going to go over here.
Okay.
The other thing that it's all CSS3, so it uses you have the ability to, when we're like doing those snapped views that they've shown off. I unfortunately can't show on here because of the resolution. You can use CSS3 media selectors like you would use when you're building a responsive UI for mobile devices here.
Does it mean can you use like CSS3 animations and stuff?
I believe you can. I haven't, but I'm pretty like if it's valid markup, it should work because the underlying rendering engine is just IE10 with Chakra and Trident. So it's all like if it runs in Internet Explorer, which IE10 I'm pretty sure is supposed to be 100% standards compliant, then it will run here. So if we go into back into our main page .css, right, we actually see that we have styling for it. I'm going to kind of walk through what we've got here. This main page here, this big long CSS selector here, this is actually just thrown in there to prevent the actual Microsoft rolled UI themes from interfering with our list view and changing the margins on it. It's kind of helpful to have it in there unless you're doing some madness with your own margins and designing your UI your own special way. Next thing we do is we go in here and we notice this MS grid row property. What this does is it basically tells this section that has the role name where to sit in the actual layout, because the layout is split into grids with rows and columns. And so we also tell it to span the rest of the rows in whatever row it sits in. So that way it takes up, so that if we want to look at it, when we saw it, we had the header, and then we had our list view. The header takes up row 0, and then everything else takes up the rest of the rows. And that's what the row span helps us do. Next thing that's kind of different here is the item description. We've gone ahead and we've told it to have a column, what MS Grid columns and MS Grid rows does, defines how big and how wide a given column or row is. So with MS Grid rows, we've decided that each row is 90 pixels big. And what we've told the item image to do, again, just like we told the layout to do, we want it to span the entirety of the item console so it looks like it's the background of the tile. Next thing we do is we've told the item overlay, which sits at the bottom of it, of the actual image, or of the tile, to sit at row 2, so that it looks like it's offset from the top, and to have its own set of rows so that we can go ahead and populate it with more data.
Can you explain the FR unit?
The what?
FR.
Oh, the FR. So that's something I actually haven't been able to find proper documentation on.
Right.
My understanding is it has to do with, I want to say, just how like it's not how many rows, because I think the rows are determined dynamically. But I want to say it's similar to the it might be a sizing kind of thing, like the or ME or EM.
So
yeah.
it's actually like fragments.
Is it fragments?
Yeah, so when you're using columns, for example, one FR means it'll span across the whole thing.
Okay.
But if you have one FR, it means you have two columns that are exactly the same width.
Got it. So so it's basically like setting it to a percentage. Yeah. That was the one thing I have been looking for answers on. I haven't been able to find.
So I see a lot of things specified here in pixels. So does anything mess up when you move to tablets or things with different resolution?
No, and
that's what FR is for.
That's a very good question. And so you do have to there's one thing that you do have to worry about. It's when you're switching between let me actually pop over to the tablet to give a good demonstration of this. Is you have to handle what's called snapped views properly. And the way we do this is, so if we look here, we pull up the weather app, and then we pull up, say, my mail app. I have to be able to, every app has to be able to run snapped. It has to handle this gracefully.
Can't see it very well.
You can't? Fix the brightness. There we go.
Yeah, that's not better.
No, it's too bright. Well, yeah, so what we see here is we've actually got this snapped view is something that you have to handle. And so you have to use the CSS3 media selectors. This one will always have a fixed width of 320 pixels, and this one will always take up the rest of your display. So if you have a 1080p display, this will be 320, this will be 1080 minus 300, or whatever the width is. So that's one thing you do have to keep in mind and have to worry about when doing this. But beyond that, most of the layout should scale properly. And I like, if you run an app in portrait and landscape mode, it just kind of resizes itself automatically. The layout engine is pretty smart like that. So now that we've gone ahead and actually defined these CSS properties, we can go ahead and actually run the application and see that we've got grid views. And we've actually got something that is starting to look like an application. Just stop taking its sweet time. Oh, and of course it's running in the simulator. Excuse me 1 second. There we go. Local machine. There we go. And voila. But right now, so we got our grid of every building in the Kane API, but we can't really do anything with them yet. So when we tap on the one thing that's really key to understand when building these Windows Store apps is that you need to expect you need to think of what should the user expect to happen when they invoke a user interface control. So when I click on a building name, I expect to see the details of that building. So what we're going to have to do now is we're going to have to navigate away from the view to another view that will actually show us the building details. And so first thing we're going to do is we're actually going to add a new folder. And we're just going to call it view building. And in here we're going to go into add new item. And we're going to use a page control, view building.html. This will go ahead and this will throw in some CSS, some HTML, and some JavaScript files that are scaffolded for us to use. So now we've got view building. We want, whenever we click on one of those items in the object, we want to navigate over to that. So back in mainpage.js, we're going to want to make some modifications to the actual item template again. So the first thing we do is we're first going to want to get a reference to the WinJS navigator. We can say var is equal to winjs.navigation namespace, and this will just give us some helpers that will allow us to perform that frame-based navigation. Next thing we want to do is to the page object, we want to add another function called ItemInLove. And in here, we're going to want to go ahead and when we tap an item, this function is going to get invoked, and the WinJS is going to go ahead and tell us everything about the caller of the method. So what we're going to need to know is which tile was pressed. In order to do this, we go ahead and say var building is equal to cane.buildings.getAt, and we're going to go ahead and say args.detail.itemIndex. And this will go ahead and just use the index of the item in the array to go ahead and get us the full object. The next thing we want to do is we want to use that nav object we just created. We want to go ahead and tell it nav.navigate to the HTML page that we just created. So it's pages, view building.html. And we also need to tell which page, you can tell the view which building it's supposed to be showing details for. And the way we do that is we actually pass it an object as a parameter of navigation. And we go ahead and say building name is building name. So next thing we need to do is we actually need to tell the UI to use this event, or to use this method. So back here in ListView, we want to go ahead and say on item invoked. We're going to want to go ahead and set that to this dot item invoked, and we want to call the bind method on here. And we want to go ahead and this just basically says, okay, whenever item invoked is called, we're going to go ahead and pass it the page object as arguments. So once we do that, we'll navigate over to this viewbuilding.html page. And the first thing we're going to do here is we're actually just going to go ahead and make a div, dummy div, and we're just going to say name. And in here, when we get our navigation event, the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to check to see if we're navigating to it. So we want to make sure that we have the building name property. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to get any data from Kane for the building, and something has clearly gone wrong. Or is not equal to null. Just for now, I'm actually just going to display it out to the screen. So we're going to go element.querySelector, building name dot inner HTML is equal to options.building. Now, when we run this, the HTML, or when we navigate to the page, it should just show us which page which building we've navigated to. And as we can see, we've navigated to GGBL. If we switch over to Duderstat, same thing. So that's how we handle navigation, and we're still remaining within the context of that default.html page, but everything is just happening as a frame within there, and there's a navigation history that we can use. So finally, what we're going to want to do is we're going to go ahead and pull the data down from the Kane API once more. I've actually gone ahead and jumped ahead and pre-written just walked through the code for this because it's very similar to the last code we wrote, but with some slight minor differences. And we want to, when we get the computers, we want to group them based on which room they're in the actual building. And so we're still querying the data the same way. We're still using the Kane API. We're just passing in the building name as a parameter. And then we're going to, when we add the element to the object, or to the list, the binding list, we're going to do something slightly different with the binding list this time. So if we go into kaneAPI.js, which is, if you remember what we were starting with, we've gone ahead and added a function called getRoomsForBuilding that takes in the building name as a parameter. And what this function basically does is it, just like last time, we create a new WinJS binding list. But the next thing we do is we actually we go ahead and we call the createGrouped method on the binding list that basically tells it, okay, all the data in here is sorted into groups based on the key room.name, and the actual group is defined as the room. So that whenever we see that an object has that property, we know it's in that group. And that's how we sort it. So when we're going ahead and we're iterating through we're doing the same XHR request, except we're passing in the building name as a URI parameter. And then we're just iterating through each object again. We're grabbing the data we want, host name, vendor, whether or not the actual computer is in use. And the vendor is actually the operating system that's currently running. So Linux or Windows. And then we finally, down here, we say which building and which room it belongs to. This string is just a friendly representation of the building plus name. So it kind of just gives us some of that. And then we go ahead and push it into that room list that we created. But instead of returning the room list, we're returning the grouped object that actually is bound to the underlying room list that allows us to sort it based on groups. So that's very similar to what we did, except with the one exception, we're working with groups now.
Wait, so you can have it be grouped before populating it with data then?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, so basically all it does is like we know what the object's going to look like regardless of when we populate it. So we're just going to go ahead and designate what those keys are right off the bat. So that way, you can do it before or after. I think both are valid. It's preference. So back here, things are relatively the same. The only difference is, so we do still check to see if the building name is null. And then from there, we go ahead and we call that getRoomsForBuilding function with the building name as a parameter. And then when we're populating the data, we still use item.dataSource. That's all the same. But the only thing that's different is we also have a property on ListView called GroupDataSource. And what this basically does is it allows us to tell us, okay, what are we grouping these objects by? So it kind of tells the UI response to that and makes it all pretty nice. So in order to do this, we call the building data, which if you remember was the grouped list that we returned. We call the groups property and we get the data source from that group. We then go ahead and we need to assign a template for the actual header of each group. I've gone ahead and actually made one in the HTML view that is of type WinJS.binding.template again, just like the last item template was. But this one only has one property. It's a span, and the text content is sent to that friendly string that we have from the API. So all in all, if you look at the code, this view is relatively the same, except that we're grouping data. And that it can be kind of tricky at first when you're like looking at it in some of the samples they provide. But when you look at it at just a basic level, it's actually pretty easy. The CSS is largely the same for the details, just with different classes. If we go ahead and actually run the application again, we will see that we are grabbing the data and we are binding it and grouping it. So give me 1 second. So we'll go into the EEX building. We can see that over in 1230 EEX we have not that many, or we have a decent amount in use, but it's pretty straightforward, pretty simple to do, and it ends up looking pretty nice. This took us about 40 minutes to write this, and with more time you can add plenty of other features. One thing that would be really nifty is in Windows 8. If you look here, every app, almost every app, has what's called an app bar. It would be really nice to have the ability to, on our app bar in here, to say, I want to go ahead, I visit this building every day. I want to have this at the touch of my fingertip. I want to pin this building to my start screen. That's something we could do. We could also move ahead and say we want to go ahead and add a live tile that connects to another web service that tells us when one of our favorite buildings has computers available, or how many computers are available in it. Things like that. There are a lot of ways to actually tailor the user experience of your application to be very unique for the app. Another thing that would be great that I could possibly add is search. In Windows 8, every app can support what's called a search contract. And it basically allows you, so if you have an enormous amount of data in the app, you can just, so like if I want to search my music library, I don't even have to open the app up. I can just search for Queen, whatever my favorite song is. Or I can just switch over to whatever. So I mean, like there are a lot of ways you can go with functionality, a lot of unique things that you can build, and the hope is eventually that a lot of the code you write here can be reused on your phone or in your web browser, wherever, to kind of provide a consistent user experience across all platforms. So I just want to thank you all very much for listening to me, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
Something I was curious about is you showed a lot of this grid view.
Uh-huh.
Are there other controls?
Yes.
You can use like perhaps a list would be more relevant.
So a list view is actually so what we are using is a list view, and we're styling it as a grid view. So like it's the so like for example, let me pull up the mail app. This right here is a list view. This is the identical like base control, and what changes is how you style it. So if you style it, if you tell it to be a list view, it'll look like just a normal list. If you tell it to be a grid view, if we go back into actually viewbuilding.js, we can go in here, this grid layout. We have other kinds of layouts that we can use. So we can use winjs.ui.list layout. This would go ahead and tell it to order it as a list. I don't think it'll still look like a really ugly list because we haven't changed the CSS for it. But you can do it. There's another layout, or you can also have, there are some baked in user controls we can use. Hold on, let me find it. There's a thing called a flip view, and if IntelliSense would play nice, it's not. A flip view is essentially where you can kind of, I'm trying to think if there are any similar, I'm sure there are similar ones in iOS, but basically I have like a picture album, and I can just flip through pictures, is the idea. There are a lot of really cool controls as a part of WinJS and a part of Windows 8 in general.
Two questions. So can you just like display, like let's say like I had a web page with CSS already done. Like, could I display that in like a view?
So you should be able to. You would have to optimize it for the navigation. Unless you're just doing it as a single page app, you should be able to port it 100% like without any difficulties. The only concern I would have is like if you're wanting to push this into the Windows Store, you have to make sure that it meets certain Windows Store guidelines.
Right.
So there are things like that snapped view I showed you on the thing. That is absolutely required for using that.
Okay. I have another question about it.
Okay.
So like if you're building large scale JavaScript, it can get like really, really unwieldy. Is that, I mean like, do they kind of help out with that, or I don't know?
So yeah, so if you're building like, huge, lots and lots of JavaScript with like lots of data models and complex interactions, it can get really messy really very quickly. I believe TypeScript is supposed to help with that. TypeScript is a new it's a JavaScript to Java, or TypeScript to JavaScript compiler, similar to CoffeeScript and.
So you can use TypeScript in here?
So yeah, TypeScript is actually supported under here, and I believe that you can.
Well, TypeScript compiles to JavaScript. So
yeah,
just
but like I believe there are native extensions for the compiler that you can use and integrate it right into Visual Studio as a part of this. I think some people have used CoffeeScript with it, but I can imagine that the tooling for that is not the best, so I would probably stray away from that and lean more towards TypeScript.
I guess this is an aside, but can you embed like an application within an application? Like say back when you had the list of computers, perhaps in a different environment, maybe when someone tapped on one, you want to open a remote desktop to it and display it there?
So then that brings me to another really interesting thing. So you can't embed an application in there, but what you can do is you can do, similar to that search contract, there's something, or not search, we want to use the, so let me just pop back into the actual app. For a second here, no, don't open up Team Foundation Server. Don't ever open up Team Foundation Server. So like if we go in here and we look at the actual Windows key C, the charms bar, we have this thing called a share contract, and we can define what this app can share with other apps. So say you have a remote desktop application, you can tell that remote desktop application that it will receive URIs to remote desktops. You could then have this Kane application have the abilities, like when I get down into the actual UI and have the ability to look at a computer's details, I can go ahead and say, okay, I want to share this computer with the remote desktop app and have it connect to the host name. That's definitely possible. But in terms of like actually embedding the application, no, I shouldn't say no, it would just get really messy and would probably fail certification.
Oh no, I was just
Oh.
scratching.
Can you like talk a bit about certification actually?
Yeah, so certification, it's really interesting. It's so similar to like on iOS, and does Android have certification now? I thought they did at the Play. They didn't do it with Play. So with like with iOS, you have
It's like they require that you have like certain icons of certain sizes, but it's not strongly enforced.
okay.
It's like, like-
So more akin to iOS, where you have basically there are a. Let me see. There is a huge long list of guidelines that you have to be aware of. That just and like they're pretty basic. If you're writing the code really nicely, you shouldn't run into any problems. But some of the ones that trip people up are you always have to have a privacy policy if you're using anything on the internet. You will. I have failed certification many a time because of that. The other thing you have to be aware of is you have your application has to suspend in 5 seconds, or it's 2 seconds now, and it has to resume in 5 seconds. So like when you're switching between apps here, the app isn't actually killed. It goes into what's called a suspended state, where all the memory is just, it stays in memory, but it's kind of frozen. And as the operating system needs more memory, if you haven't been used in a while, they're just going to go ahead and terminate your application. So before it goes into that suspended state, any application critical data needs to be serialized within 2 seconds. So that's another certification thing you have to be aware of. If you're writing asynchronous code, you won't run into too many issues with that. You can request deferrals and things like that. But
So I'm guessing they probably have like pornography.
yes, so there are. Let me actually bring up
No, but like what happens if you build like a photo sharing app and someone uploads porn?
So you are.
Is that like,
Are we-
I think it's the Windows or you're allowed.
So you have to have a terms of service to like have a way of handling it. I think. So like I built an app that takes in user generated data, and when you're looking at that, you have to have some kind of mechanism for reporting anything that's obscene, because you're not allowed to have any adult only applications. So like that's something where like I don't think you can necessarily get removed from the store, but it can impact your feedback negatively. And so your application goes through, I want to say, 7 steps of certification. The first thing is just pre-signing. They just sign your application, make sure it works. Then they run it through some automated tests. There's actually a toolkit that ships with Visual Studio called the Windows Application Certification Kit. I highly recommend you run this before you submit to certification, because it's all the automated tests that they're going to run on your application. If you fail those, you're going to just be in a really bad feedback loop. So you want to make sure you're passing those before you submit to the store. One second. Then there are, after that you go into security checks, which just make sure there's no malware. And then finally there's like a 7-day content compliance period, where a human will run your application and make sure it matches every single guideline and make sure there's nothing they're overlooking.
Does that include UX guidelines?
Those aren't as strictly as enforced as, say, privacy policy and content. UX guidelines, they do give you feedback on. They were more stringent like 2 months ago, but now they've been lightened up. Can I go to John first and then you?
If you get an app into published right now,
Yep.
do you have free stuff?
So the terms of these, the conditions are, I think it's supposed to be done by Friday. So leave very little time, but if you have an app in the store by Friday, you can be entered to receive one of 2,000 of these. So they're giving away 2,000 slates to, it's US only, but they're giving away these Samsung Series 7 slates as an incentive for getting an app in the store. If you, I don't think, because it's, Tuesday today? I don't think you'll make it into content compliance by then. If you have an idea, write an app, submit it, and then I can talk to some people and see if because it sounds like the actual guidelines of the contest might be changing. But beyond that, if you get there, you can do that. There's also a contest being sponsored by Stack Overflow and Microsoft called Activate.ms. You submit an app to Stack Overflow, users vote on it. There's a $5,000 prize, and I think a couple of tablets are being given away. There's also, I think this is ending tomorrow though, codeproject.com. If you submit an article about Windows 8, you can win one of 300 Ultrabooks that are from Intel that are actually really nice reference models. Your question, Ben?
So you're talking about like the barriers to getting an app into the store. If I make an app, and can I just give it to someone else and use this a separate means? Like when someone else like gets my app, what kind of barriers do they have?
So yeah, so that's a really good question because like so it depends on the device you're looking at, and like because the scenario you're talking about is if you want to load a application onto a friend's computer without going through the store certification.
Either that or just having a company self-host their own.
So the company one is a bit of a trickier scenario. The easier one is to friend. You can do what's called side loading, which like in order to debug apps, you have to get a developer account and unlock your machine for development use.
You have to pay for a developer account?
Students don't. So students get a free year of developer account through MSDN.
You only get a year?
No, it might be 2 years.
I think a year, but you can reapply every year.
Exactly, yeah, that's it. So you get a free coupon code for registration every year, along with other things. But so like that allows you to unlock the computer and just run unsigned code. For a company, that you have to go through an enterprise channel. Like you have to have your own enterprise.
Is it right to say that like if you don't have a developer account and have your machine unlocked, you cannot run anything that's not been assigned by the store?
For now. That's all I'll say.
But that's like for like full, like you can run like previously like.
Oh, so like are you thinking like old DXEs, or are you just thinking about these Windows Store apps?
I assume yeah. So I guess for Windows.
So
Windows 8 apps.
So Windows 8 apps, those have to be signed to run on a computer that is not developer unlocked. That isn't to say that people aren't probably working on ways around that. I'm sure the jailbreak community is already fast at work trying to figure it out. But it's, as of right now, you have to have a developer account to unlock, to run these unsigned Windows Store apps. The developer accounts used to be free. You might not even actually need a developer account. Now that I think about it, you just have to have a Windows Live ID. And I think it unlocks every 3 months, you have to unlock it. So like you don't have to have the Windows Store account to debug, but they said that they'll be checking to see who's actually using Visual Studio.
For Windows Phone 7, you needed a developer.
For Windows Phone 7, you did.
So if you get it approved by the store, but then can you have people download it directly from you, or do you have to? You
have to go through the store.
To the store.
Yeah. So like for just like any regular Joe, like your mom and dad to run your app, they would have to get it through the store, unless you sat down, typed in a Windows Live ID, running Visual Studio as a full administrator, and unlocked the computer. So that is one of the drawbacks of it. Yeah.
How many apps are there on the Windows Store? There's 2,000 slates being given.
Yeah. So these are US only. These are US only. Internationally, I want to say it's up to 5,000. But like, so I don't have an exact number, but there are plenty of these left.
Yeah, that sounds like really good odds.
Yeah, so like, I mean, and it's not even a matter, so like, once you get it published, you said like, I'll throw my contact information up after the thing. If you contact me, I can get you all the information on how to submit to the Great Slate giveaway after this. The only issue is you have like this amount of days left, and I'm not sure if they're extending the offer by a week or two or not. Any other questions? Just want to thank you all for coming, and it was a pleasure talking to you guys.